The last step in the rough body fabrication is to route the binding channels on both the top and the bottom. I have my StewMac binding bit in the router here. And with all the problems I had in the last video with kickback, I absolutely have a starting pin in here. I'm going to be taking very light cuts to kind of ease my way into finding the level. And I'll probably end up fast forwarding through this because this is going to take a while. But when I'm done, I should have two nicely routed binding channels. So now I have both my binding channels done. You just go through and slowly move up the bit until you get to where you are. I have my binding in hand, of course. And so now when we line them up, you can see, it fits nice in the groove. Just slightly proud of the top so I can scrape this off after I put the binding on. On this side, it's a little bit different. I had these cracks before I showed in the other video. To make sure that I hide them, I had to go a little bit deeper. So my channel is actually slightly lower than, let's see if I can get that in there, slightly lower than the top. And so this will be an interesting challenge. I'm not sure if I'll hand plane this or take a long time with the sander, but some way I'll figure it out to make the maple part of the top just a little bit thinner so that my binding fits on properly. With the rough fabrication of the guitar body done, I can now put binding on the top and the back of the guitar. I'm going to start on the back because there's a couple tricky curves, and by starting on the back it'll give me an area to practice with just in case it doesn't go so well this first time. You may think that it's actually that this corner is the one I would be worried about, but in fact it's this corner right here that's going to be much harder. The outside corner of the sharp break here, I've got my heat gun sitting on the floor here. What I'm going to end up doing is I'm going to start up top here, and I'm going to go all the way around, get to this point, use the heat gun to make this really sharp bend, put it in, and then what I'm probably going to do is actually snip it off here, and then bring another piece coming from the other direction this way, and then fuse them together with acetone. In this case, I won't have to actually do this, 90-degree curve, and the acetone will melt the binding together so that it looks like a seamless piece. So I'll go ahead and do that now. It's going to take a while, so I'll probably time-lapse this. It's one of my favorite parts of the project. So in just a few minutes of time, I've already gotten this taped up and gone around this corner, but I'm bringing this a little closer here. Not sure if you can see, okay, but the bend didn't go so well, and part of this was because when you heat this up with a heat gun, it gets so hot that it's hard to touch. Now what I'm going to do is heat this up again with the heat gun, but this time I have just the resaw bar from my bandsaw, which is just a solid piece of steel, I assume. And I'm going to use that to kind of roll the corner here, and I should be able to smooth this out. And after a little bit of heat, you can see that the joint looks much nicer now. I'm still going to have another opportunity to refine this a little bit. One, because I'm going to squirt the acetone in here, which is going to melt the corner a little bit. And then I'm also going to have the opportunity to scrape the binding flush to both the back and the sides here. And so I can just kind of gently refine this, maybe with some higher grit sandpaper, and you won't even notice, that there was any sort of bump here. So now what I'm going to do is go ahead, go around this corner here. Yeah, I definitely can't go around this 90 degrees. So I'm going to snip this off and then put the acetone in here to get this part of the binding attached to the body. One thing that's kind of wild about using a heat gun with plastic binding like this is on an inside curve, you can actually push, put a little tension on it, heat it up with a heat gun, and the binding will actually start to roll into the channel that it's supposed to be in. You want to be really careful that you don't hold the heat gun there too long. It will melt the plastic and make a big mess. But in the meantime, I've actually got a pretty nice bend here, which takes the tension off of the tape to make it easier to secure to the body. It doesn't take much acetone to do this. I bought this at a pharmacy. It's just a little, I think it's for giving medicine to kids. And so we'll take a couple milliliters of acetone, and I'll start placing it on the edge here. And because the because the binding is so close, the acetone's actually going to wick into the areas, and the tape will hold it on. And so what's going to happen is the acetone will melt the plastic. The tape is holding it there. The plastic and the wood fuse together, and in a very short time period, the binding will be attached to the body. This isn't working out as well as I had hoped. It turns out that I didn't put enough tape here, and the acetone got under the tape, and now it's pulling up a little bit. So the quickest way to fix that is actually just make really long pieces of tape. And so I'm going to go back, reinforce this in a couple areas. Ultimately, it won't make a huge amount of difference. If there's a gap, you can push the binding back in, go over it again with acetone, and get the process going. Now that I have it reinforced with some longer pieces of tape, I'll go back again with the acetone and remelt the binding. It shouldn't make much of a difference here. In fact, I usually go over it 2 or 3 times anyway, with the first bit of acetone to melt it, and then the second to make sure it's really in there. And so I'm going to go ahead and do a second time here, and then I'm going to let this sit for a little while so that I'm not messing with it while the plastic is melting and then re-hardening. Funny thing is, for this not working so well, I've actually bound 2 guitars at this point, and so this is the first time, I guess, not having too much luck today with the acetone going under the tape and lifting it up. I still think we're going to work out okay. It's been about 3 hours since I put this piece of binding on. It's not really clear how long it takes for this to be fully cured. I'm fairly confident that the binding is all in place right now. So what I'm going to do is just take off a little bit of this tape. I'll just leave the other one on just for good measure, and then just kind of take off any pieces that might be in the way. And then I'll go back and do this other piece right here. One thing you'll see if you use the StewMac binding tape and acetone is that acetone actually melts the adhesive backing of the tape. This really isn't an issue. As I mentioned before, the next step after the binding is applied is to actually go across the top, scrape the binding level, and so I'll use my card scraper there to clean this up as well. And of course, I haven't even done anything near preparation for finishing the guitar, and so we'll easily clean up all this adhesive after we're done the binding. So I finally have everything taped up for the other side. I was able to make this bend pretty easily, which was great. I've trimmed off the piece here at the where the edge of the body joins the single cutaway, and so hopefully I can press those two together, melt the binding together, and then I did the same thing at this end, and so I used some extra long pieces of tape this time. And so hopefully the binding will stay put, and I'll probably leave this overnight and then come back in the morning and bind the top. So this is working better than last time with the longer tape over here. And so as I mentioned, I'll press this in a little bit just to make sure everything is tight. But other than that, I'll leave it to cure all night, take the tape off in the morning, and then do the other side. The binding's had a chance to dry overnight, so now I'll take off the tape and see what happened. overall, I couldn't be more pleased on how this turned out. The tight corners look really, really great. I'm also really happy on how the edge pieces fused together. I wasn't really sure how this was going to work, but I think with a little bit of light sanding and smoothing, I should be able to make that look seamless. And same thing up here with at the neck. It looks great. One downside that I do see is right here at the cutaway. I guess I wasn't able to tape it tight enough, so I have one little gap there. But I sort of expected that, as a beginner. I'm still, getting the technique down. So what I can do is just kind of go back with that, melt a little bit of the binding in acetone, jam that paste in there, and then when I go through with the card scraping, I should be able to fill it. And it really shouldn't be too obvious. So the next step is actually just to repeat the process, but this time on the top. Since last time I got in a situation where I would have liked to have longer tape, and also because I want to fuse this corner together, I'm actually going to try binding the whole thing at once and doing acetone all at once. Hopefully it's the case that by using longer pieces of tape and wrapping them over, for instance, here at the cutaway, that I'll get an even better result than I did last time. One way I'm going to try and mitigate where the acetone goes, especially in terms of the tape, is to hold the body at a little bit of an angle so that the acetone runs downhill. One of the issues that you have is acetone is so thin, it will wick anywhere, which is awesome for doing this binding melting trick, but it will wick against gravity up the tape. And so hopefully this will all work out, and then the next step will be to scrape the binding flush to the top and back and on the sides. What I'm doing here is just using my resaw bar from my bandsaw and really just pushing against the binding. It's hard to explain how this works, but when you put the acetone on, it wicks into the gap and it melts the binding a little bit. And by pushing on this, the binding's already soft and melty a little bit on the inside. And like using wood glue with two pieces and you get some squeeze out, you can actually get a light squeeze out coming out here. In this case, with the cream binding, it almost looks like milk, comes out just a little bit. I mean, it's not going to be enough that you have it running all over the place, but by pushing in like this and using this flat bar on the side, I can keep the binding relatively true to the sides, but also getting a nice firm push so that the binding fits around, the outline of the guitar. see if I can show this in the camera here. Okay. This part right here, in there you can see a couple little dots. There's a few more. Few more on this side here. And that's enough. You don't need to do a ton of acetone. You just need to do enough to melt it. The tape holds it in place. And then, after all the curing is done, the binding is attached to the body. So I'm going to let this sit for a while. I got to go back to work. Then we'll take the tape off and see how we did.